In the Philippines, there's this common greeting, Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. Well, I'm pretty sure most of you have no idea what that means. And that's completely okay because I just said good evening to all of you in Tagalog, one of the many languages of the Philippines. I'm sure all of you can remember at least one experience where there was some form of a language barrier. You could have been on a late night Skype call with your family across the globe, or simply eating at a restaurant wondering if the waiters were talking about you. Sometimes you can become anxious or feel left out when you are unable to understand a language, and that idea of disconnectedness and alienation is the subject of my talk today, specifically focused on one's linguistic abilities. Starting with my title, to most people it would seem like a reference to the phrase having a way with words. However, away, spelled A-W-A-Y in Tagalog, means fight. This title shows how I needed to fight with words, and sometimes I wish to do away with them before finally being able to learn and gain a way with them. So I just wanted to share a few of my own personal stories as well as some observations I've had in my typical day-to-day life. To begin, my name is Vera and I'm a senior here at Valencia High School. I am 100% Filipino born here in America. So for basically my whole life, up until about last year, I was only able to understand Tagalog. I grew up in a household where my parents would speak a mix of Tagalog and English, which I like to call Taglish, and at all of our family gatherings, I was surrounded by a lot of Tagalog-speaking family members. Tagalog was never really that challenging for me to understand. However, I was never really able to reach that stage where I felt comfortable enough to speak it fluently in return. And I was left in this awkward stage of only being able to understand someone, but not being able to reply with the language. I never really realized this until the second trip back home to the Philippines. Back when I was just 3 years old, I went to visit my family in the Philippines for the very first time. And my cousins on my dad's side were the ones I would play with all the time. However, when I went back in 2013, instead of the same playful cousins, I was met with people who just stared at me with nervous looks. They appeared tense because it was a very strange situation where I could understand them but not speak Tagalog back. I slowly began to realize that my inability to do something as simple as talking to my cousins made me an outsider within my own family. This marks one lesson I learned about the power of language. For as long as I can remember, whenever I'd meet someone new, whether it be a parent's friend or a distant family member, the same situation would always play out. It would typically start with, "Hi, wow, you're so tall. How old are you? Do you speak Tagalog?" To which I would reply, "Well, I can understand everything." Then they would smirk, give me a look, and say, "Oh, that's good, but you should learn." Every time this occurred, I was reminded of the negative stigma associated with only being able to understand or not be fluent in your native language. But as a young and naive American-born Filipino, I thought that this was the norm and that everyone in my generation, at least, regardless of their race, mostly spoke English. A distance had grown between myself and my culture, at least linguistically, because I still really loved the food. And I carried a thought in my head that speaking Tagalog would be considered weird. This whole idea changed when I stepped foot into my best friend Bill Chung's car for the very first time. And when this happened, I realized that people in my generation speak their native language because when I first stepped foot into his car, the first thing I noticed was that Bill was speaking fluent Vietnamese with his mom. That day, I learned that there are people in my generation who speak their native language and that language bridges gaps between generations and connects people back to their roots. During the writing process of my talk, I came across the term linguistic determinism, which means that we think differently based on the language that we are speaking. I feel like this idea perfectly encapsulates the idea of my talk because Tagalog brings me back to my roots and makes me feel a sense of belonging in the Filipino community. There are words in the Filipino language that don't translate well into other languages. For example, there's a feeling known to Filipinos as kilig, and I struggle to find the best words to convey the same effect. Kilig is best described as that feeling of romantic excitement or giddy with your own personal encounters with love, or simply just seeing the actors' chemistry on all the Filipino dramas. These special words carry such a special meaning to those who know, and I strive for that ability. That one small encounter that I mentioned earlier prompted a drive in me to change my perspective on the power of language. Sometimes language can be more powerful than some may perceive it to be, and sometimes words can speak louder than actions because it can bring a sense of belonging between two people. In an ever-changing world, it's hard to find something that can secure a stable bond between two people, but one thing remains relatively constant, and that thing is language. It can bring a sense of belonging between two people who share a common ancestry or country of origin, because language sprouts from the roots of a culture into its branches or networks of people. Now, I hope that you have a better understanding of the power of language and that if English isn't your native language, that you can leave here with a new motivation to learn yours. Nelson Mandela once wrote, "Without language, one cannot talk to people and understand them, one cannot share their hopes and aspirations, grasp their history, appreciate their poetry, or savor their songs." Thank you. Maraming salamat.